I've been to my fair share of forts over the years, just saying, but nothing like this majestic one, called Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Out of all of the forts that I've been to, they say that this one is the most haunted. There's some really cool ghost stories that have gone on, probably beyond the years, the decades, and the century.
Okay, Fort George was constructed in 1796 to essentially act as a counter to the American Fort Niagara, as well as to guard the Niagara River, which was one of the main transportation routes really on the continent. We move on in time, Fort George's importance really increased. It actually became the main headquarters in the Niagara area, or the Centre Division as it was known during the War of 1812. It was actually destroyed by the Americans by artillery fire from the opposite shore, burnt right to the ground, with one exception. Our powder magazine, oddly enough, or ironically enough, actually managed to survive that massive artillery bombardment. And was actually the scene. Once it was destroyed, 2 days later, the Americans attacked, actually along the shores of Lake Ontario. Huge army, 6,000 plus men, and the British had 1,350. Just from that math, you can likely gather what the outcome of that battle would be. And after a very short but nasty firefight, the Americans succeeded in routing the British. And that left the Niagara area, obviously Fort George included, now under the occupation of U.S. forces for the next 7 months.
Anniversary of the War of 1812 began in 2012 and in 2016, the anniversary. Now, 2012, October 13th, 2012, Friday the 13th, funny enough, the reenactment, I believe it was the 13th at least, the reenactment of the Battle of Queenston Heights for the 200th anniversary of that battle took place. General Isaac Brock was shot and killed at the Battle of Queenston Heights, 1812, October. Now, he of course was the general here at Fort George, and in fact once he was killed, he was brought back to Fort George and buried here originally. Today he sits under Brock's monument, but twice he was buried here at Fort George under Brock's bastion. So, we are taking part in this reenactment. We've spent quite a lot of time up at Queenston Heights doing a lot of different things. It is late at night. We've come back to Fort George. We are now back at Fort George. We're unchanging. It's the end of the day. We walk out, me and two other friends who have both witnessed this. We walk outside and we see a man dressed in General Isaac Brock's uniform. Now, when you're reenacting, you're only having one General Isaac Brock, because if we have 2,000 of them running around, things are going to get very, very confusing. So there is only one uniform. And that uniform is worn by a fellow by the name of Mr. Finley. Now, Mr. Finley, we assume, is up on that bastion there smoking his pipe. We wave hello. Now, General Isaac Brock's uniform has a nice bright rainbow sash, wonderful plumes of feathers coming out of his hat, and that's exactly what we see. Assuming it's Mr. Finley, we wave hello. This fellow is smoking his pipe. He turns to us. He doesn't say anything. We assume Mr. Finley wants to continue smoking his pipe, having a nice little time in the night, and we walk out into the parking lot. Now, we walk out to the parking lot and the car pulls in. Out walks Mr. Finley in the single uniform of Sir General Isaac Brock. We suddenly put a few things together. It is the 200th anniversary of General Isaac Brock, of his death. The place that we have just seen this fellow is Brock's Bastion, the original burial place of General Isaac Brock. 200 years to the day, I have seen a fellow dressed in his uniform, standing on his original burial place. We went back into the fort. There was no one there. I don't like coming here at night. I have no explanation for what I saw. I'd like to believe that there's one, but to this day I haven't been able to come up with one.
We're way at the back end of Fort George. Some people never even make it this far back during their tour of the fort. And to be honest, I mean, there's not a whole lot to it unless you're a tunnel aficionado. But I suppose it's exciting to find Find somewhere dark and slightly colder underground when you're here on a hot day. It leads out to a lookout tower, which is actually located outside the walls of Fort George. And that's really about it. You walk through the tunnel, you go up the stairs, you realize, wow, I'm looking out through some musket ports in an old lookout tower, and then it's back down and out. But for our ghost tour, I guess there's a little more excitement here in the tunnel. Now it basically extends about 60, 70 feet straight away. So just long enough that you realize, wow, it's dark, it's confined, and it's a little uncomfortable in here. Because most of us North Americans, we're not really familiar with what is true darkness. And here in the tunnel, it is truly dark. Now, where we get our stories for the ghost tour, we're lucky enough that people are willing to share their experiences. So we do spend a fair amount of time at the end of tours talking to people about, what has happened to them, either during the ghost tour or, on previous visits to Fort George. And a number of years ago, we were lucky enough to have 3 little ladies on the tour, 3 little old ladies who were willing to share their experiences. Now, 2 of them had been through the fort before. They'd come through the fort during the day, done the history tour. This would have been, 30 years ago. They went through the tunnel here, and upon exiting from the tunnel, I guess one of these ladies had glanced back and remarked, oh, look, the lights in the tunnel have gone out. Perhaps we should find a staff member, let them know that a fuse is blown, or some such. Well, the woman that was with her, she looked back and, well, what are you talking about? It's plain as day. No lights, the lights are still on. So this first woman looked a little more carefully, and indeed she could see that the two or three first sets of lights, well, they were lit. But beyond that, her view of the back of the tunnel was obscured by what she describes as a solid mass of darkness, a cloud of shadow that filled the far end of the tunnel and was slowly boiling out towards her. And as she watched, from this darkness, 3 figures took form. Figures of men with tall black hats, much like the shako caps worn by both British and American soldiers who fought and died here. Well, seeing these things coming towards her, she turned about, headed back for the gates just as fast as her legs could take her. 25 years later, she returned to Fort George on a ghost tour. And we think that she didn't realize that this was the fort until she got to the entrance to the tunnel and realized that the tour would be going in. But at the same time, 25 years later, 30 people around, what could possibly happen? Well, she only made it 3 steps into the tunnel before she could feel these entities closing in around her. So she took those 3 steps right back out again to wait for us outside. So many people here on the ghost tour, and perhaps at Fort George during the day as well, make the decision that the tunnel is not the place for them. In some cases, it's the darkness. In some cases, it's the confined space. In some cases, it's the bats. But in other cases, maybe they've picked up on something here that they're just not comfortable with. And one of the stories about the tunnel here at Fort George that doesn't often make it onto the ghost tour, just doesn't tell well, is about something that doesn't exist here in the tunnel. But at the end of one of my tours, a number of years ago, that as we exited from the tunnel, that the guys that were kind of out first, which meant that they'd been the last ones into the tunnel. That means that they would have been, walking at some distance from my lantern. And it is pitch black here, that you cannot see your hand in front of your face if you happen to be at any distance from the illumination here in the tunnel. So these guys were the first ones in, which meant they were walking in darkness. And they wanted to know where the door went. Kyle, where does the door go? Now, these guys had been kind of a little bit rowdy earlier in the tour, so I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, are they trying to make fun of me here? Are they asking a question to see if I'll give them a stupid answer that they can make fun of me, or what's going on here? So I kind of went, I don't quite understand. Well, they repeated themselves. Well, where does the door go? Well, I kind of explained, well, look, there's the door to the tunnel itself that we walked in. And then thinking that maybe they'd sneaked up the stairs to take a peek at the lookout tower, there's an external door that leads to a little, an alcove within the walls. Well, no, they wanted to know where the door in the tunnel went. And it seems that as they explained what had happened, that as they came in, naturally, like most people, that when you're stuck in the darkness of the tunnel, You don't want to bump into anything, and you get a little dizzy because you're disoriented. So most people, one hand in front of them so they don't bump into the person next to them, and the other hand kind of runs along the wall just to keep you balanced, to keep you going in a straight line. Well, as they walked in, the two of them, seems they're running their hands down the wall here. Stone wall, stone wall, stone wall, wooden door frame, wooden door, metal furniture, wooden door frame, stone wall, stone wall, stone wall. And both of them, about 12 feet into the tunnel, on the right-hand side of the tunnel, as you make your entrance, which would be about here, that they encountered a door. Well, myself and everybody else in the tour kind of looked at these guys and went, heh. And we left it at that. They kind of were embarrassed because their experience was quite different than anybody else's experience. So I kind of wrote that off as, something funny, whether it was a joke that had gone wrong or I don't know. But when other people started asking, hey, Kyle, where does the door go? Well, you start to think, maybe there's something to it there. And when my wife, who had worked at Fort George for years, who had worked on the ghost tour for years, while doing ghost tour security one night, came into the tunnel so that she could hear the tour guide, so that she could hear how somebody else gave the stories. Here at the back of the tunnel, one hand in front of you so you don't bump into anything, one hand sliding against the wall, stone wall, wooden door frame, stone wall. Now you gotta wonder though, if it were you encountering a door that obviously doesn't exist for everyone, that obviously doesn't exist during the day, what do you do then? Are you one of the people that go, that was interesting, and then back away and leave the door alone? Or are you one of the people who try the lock? If it's open,